Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about your right to parody. Let's begin with the historical background. In 1983, Campari, the Italian aperitif, was running a risque advertising campaign featuring actors such as Elizabeth Ashley, Jill St. John, and Tony Roberts, talking about their first time. Double entrees abounded, and it all sounded like they were dishing about sex. On the inside front cover of the November 1983 issue of Hustler magazine, published by Larry Flynt, there was a similar-looking Campari ad featuring a dignified photograph of the famous televangelist Jerry Falwell. In a fake interview, Reverend Falwell is portrayed as saying that his first time was a drunken trius with his mother in an outhouse. Shockingly, the more you read, the worse it gets. In response, Falwell sent out 3 mailings, some of which contained a copy of the ad parody, to more than 1 million of his supporters, attacking, quote, the billion-dollar sex industry of which Larry Flynt is a self-declared leader. For those porno peddlers, it appears that lust and greed have replaced decency and morality, unquote. In a month, Falwell raised more than $1 million for his litigation war chest. He soon sued Flynt, saying it was because the ad, quote, besmirched the memory of my dear mother, unquote. Flynt published the ad parody again in Hustler's March 1984 issue while the case moved forward to trial. To fully comprehend the almost apocalyptic nature of this free speech issue, it is necessary to examine the personal histories of the 2 men leading their opposed organizations. In 1956, when Jerry Falwell was 22 years old, he founded the Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. What began with a congregation of 35 people would expand to 1,000 members a year later and to more than 20,000 in the 1980s and beyond. The church also grew to include a school, summer camp, home for alcoholics, international missions, and Liberty University, an accredited evangelical liberal arts institution. In 1965, he criticized Dr. King and the civil rights movement as having, quote, done more to help damage race relations and to engender hate than to help, unquote. Perhaps Falwell's most inflammatory comment came shortly after 9/11, when he initially cast blame for the attacks on a coalition of liberal groups. Quote, I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, all of them who have tried to secularize America. I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen, unquote. No matter how his remarks were received by the general public, Falwell continued to willingly embrace his role as a lightning rod for his fundamentalist faith. In everything Falwell did, or said and did, he set himself out as a moral examiner, preaching what he believed were the old-fashioned values necessary to save America from spiritual ruin. Hustler was an enormous financial success, but the magazine's exploding public presence also made it a bigger target. Flynt would soon be drawn into a string of trials for obscenity. While fighting obscenity charges in Georgia on March 6, 1978, Flynt and one of his attorneys were walking towards the slightly shabby but still dignified courthouse in the town square when they were shot multiple times. Flynt and the attorney survived, but Flynt would be left paralyzed from the waist down and suffering from, quote, peripheral nerve damage, unquote, that would cause him intense pain for years. Years later, a white supremacist convicted of 8 murders who claimed responsibility for killing another 20 African Americans and Jews between 1977 and 1980 also confessed to shooting Flynt. The gunman said he targeted Flynt because he saw photographs in Hustler's December 1975 issue of an interracial couple having sex. Harvard professor Frederick Scratcher said, quote, characterizing Larry Flynt's magazine as sexually explicit rather than sexually violent reflects a position, unquote. Skyer advocated that the public should, quote, resist violence against women of a lesser order than the glorification of racial or religious violence, unquote. With these personal histories in mind, let's proceed to the lawsuit. Falwell and Flynt would face off at trial in Roanoke, Virginia, only 45 miles from the headquarters of Falwell's religious empire. The lawyers for both sides were in equally pronounced contrast in styles. Falwell brought two main claims against Flynt: libel and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The essential distinction between the two legal actions is that libel requires a false statement of fact and emotional distress does not. In other words, to win a libel action, you need to prove that there was a factual statement that was inaccurate, not an opinion statement. For example, saying Barack Obama was not born in the United States is a false statement of fact since he was born in Hawaii. Saying Barack Obama was a good president is a statement of opinion since you are expressing your thoughts about him. To win an emotional distress claim, Falwell needed only to convince a jury that Flynt, quote, intended to inflict emotional distress, was outrageous, and did in fact inflict serious emotional injury, unquote. As the trial began on December 3rd, 1984, Grutman led Falwell through questions intended to demonstrate the falsity of the ad. Falwell told the court, quote, "Since I became a Christian in 1952, I have been and am a teetotaler and never endorsed alcoholic beverages or partook of them before services or at any time," unquote. He testified that his late mother, quote, "was a godly woman, probably the closest to a saint that I have ever known," unquote, and that he, quote, "would stake his life on her purity," unquote. Despite Isaacman's efforts to skip over this impassioned line of question, Grutman was allowed by the judge to ask, quote, "Mr. Falwell, specifically, did you and your mother ever commit incest?" unquote. As the jury watched and listened, the discomfort of even having to answer such a question was successfully brought home, and Falwell answered empathetically, quote, "Absolutely not," unquote. The emotional peak of Falwell's testimony came when Grutman sought to draw out the extent of the emotional distress that the Reverend alleged to have suffered. It was an indispensable component of his claim and something of an awkward fit for the personally reserved Falwell. He nevertheless rose to the challenge when Grutman asked him for his, quote, personal reaction when he read this ad for the first time, unquote. He said, quote, "I think I have never been as angry as I was at that moment. My first impression was that Campari had purchased an ad in the magazine because I had seen a similar ad in decent magazines earlier, and my first thought was to get on the phone to Campari. Our in-house attorney and I talked it over. My anger became more rational and deeply hurt. I somehow felt that in all my life I had never believed that human beings could do something like this. I really felt like weeping. I am not a deeply emotional person. I don't show it. I think I felt like weeping. It was the most hurtful, damaging, despicable, low-type personal attack that I can imagine one human being can inflict upon another," unquote. It would be difficult for Larry Flynt to cut as convincing a figure as the apparently deeply wounded Falwell. However, Flynt rolled into the courtroom in his gold-plated wheelchair, ready to be a polished version of his authentic and surprisingly charming self. Isaacman wanted to provide a context for the Falwell parody ad by having Flynt talk about other advertising parodies his magazine had created. Flynt described one Hustler parody of Marlboro cigarettes involving, quote, a Marlboro man in the hay with his horse, having a cigarette, after sex, just a sort of a preposterous situation, unquote. Isaacman then asked Flynt what was, quote, intended to be conveyed, unquote, by this particular Campari ad parody featuring Falwell. Flynt said, quote, "Well, we wanted to poke fun at Campari for their advertisement because the innuendos that they had in their ads made you sort of confused as to if the person was talking about their first time as far as a sexual encounter or whether they were talking about their first time as far as drinking Campari. Of course, another thing that you have to do is to have a person, that is the complete opposite of what you would expect. If someone such as me might have been in there, I don't know how people would have interpreted it, but if somebody like Reverend Falwell is in there, it is very obvious that he wouldn't do any of these things, that they are not true, that it's not to be taken seriously, and there are a great deal of people in the country, especially the ones that read Hustler magazine, that feel that there should be a separation between church and state. So when something like this appears, it will give people a chuckle. They know this was not intended to defame the Reverend Falwell, his mother, or any members of his family because no one could take it seriously, unquote. Isaacman inquired next about the believability of what was written in the ad parody. Flynt said, quote, well, as far as making it with his mother, that's so outrageous. That no one can find that believable. Someone may not like it, but that's not where we're here for today is whether somebody likes it or not, but whether it's in violation of the law, unquote. Finally, Isaacman questioned Flynt as to whether his intent with the ad parody was to harm Falwell. Flynt said, quote, I don't have any, personal animosity towards Reverend Falwell. I put him, like all politicians and all evangelicals, basically in the same category. Hustler satirizes and parodies, and our basic editorial content is built around politics, sex, and religion, unquote. Flynt had accomplished all they could hope to with his testimony, making his position clear. The mockery was not intended to be taken personally, and the extreme nature of the falsehoods was the very reason the parody could not reasonably harm Falwell's reputation or feelings. At the closing arguments, the local paper reported that Grutman, in a rising voice, sought to, quote, make a statement about what he saw as the sleazy running wild in America, unquote. Grutman said, quote, certainly the eyes of the country are on Rowick, and you are going to make a statement. And that statement that you are going to make from this courthouse is going to spread throughout the length and breadth of this land. The nation is watching. The nation wants to know where the Constitution stands. Which way, America? Are you going to let loose chaos and anarchy? Are you going to turn America into the planet of the apes, unquote? Isaacman, in contrast, summed it up as a narrow First Amendment question. He said, quote, it would be ridiculous to award damages on the basis of something as frivolous as hurt feelings, unquote. After the week-long trial, the all-white, all-Protestant jury of 4 men and 8 women from the Bible Belt deliberated for about 6 hours before returning their verdict. They found that the ad parody could not, quote, reasonably be understood as ascribing actual facts about Falwell or actual events in which he participated, unquote, and that as a result, Flynt did not libel Falwell. The jury then ruled for Falwell on the emotional distress claim and awarded him $200,000 in damages. The split decision and the relatively modest damages mean both sides would claim victory and both sides would appeal parts of the decision. Almost 2 years later, the Fourth Circuit affirmed the judgment, rejecting Flynt's arguments that the emotional distress claim was limited by the First Amendment. For the first time, a federal court of appeals held that a public figure could recover damages for emotional distress without a finding of libel or invasion of privacy. Yet Flynt and Isaacman pressed on, and the case proved to be such a novel and significant free speech issue that the Supreme Court agreed to hear it. This case was called Hustler Magazine versus Falwell. Here's what happened. Isaacman began by arguing that the actual malice standard set out in Sullivan to protect libel defendants should not be, quote, evaded by a public figure by libeling or labeling his cause of action intentional infliction of emotional distress, quote, unquote, instead. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor asked if the state had, quote, an even greater interest, unquote, in protecting its citizens from emotional distress than it does in protecting reputation. Isaacman defiantly replied that reputational injury should be considered more important, since it impacts, quote, what goes on in the minds of other people as well, and not just the minds of one citizen, unquote. Isaacman was purposefully laying the foundation for the position that the actual malice standard should apply to both emotional distress as well as libel claims. Justice Brian White queried if Isaacman believed that, quote, opinion or parody is never actionable, unquote, to which he responded that parody should always be protected as long as it concerns public figures and, quote, contains nothing that could be understood as a false statement of fact, unquote. Justice John Paul Stevens then asked what the public interest in parody was. Isaacman seemed well prepared for this line of inquiry. He explained that the first interest arises when, quote, somebody who's out there campaigning against it saying, don't read our magazine and we're poison on the minds of America and don't engage in sex outside of wedlock and don't drink alcohol. Hustler has every right to say that man is full of BS, and that's what this ad parody says, unquote. Justice Antonin Scalia said, quote, the rule you give us says that if you stand for public office or become a public figure in any way, you cannot protect yourself or indeed your mother against a parody of your committing incest with your mother in an outhouse, unquote. Isaacman responded, quote, what you're talking about, Justice Scalia, is a matter of taste. And as you said in a previous decision, just as it's useless to argue about taste, it's useless to litigate it, unquote. When Scalia followed up with a question about how often Isaacman thought he was going to be able to get a jury to find that the parody was done with the intent of creating emotional distress, Isaacman said, quote, almost every time that something critical is said about something, how can any speaker come in and say, I didn't intend to cause any emotional distress and be believed? If you say something critical about another person, and if it's very critical, it's going to cause emotional distress. That's why that's a meaningless standard, unquote. Grutman started his argument off with strong words. Quote, deliberate malicious character assassination is not protected by the Constitution. Deliberate malicious character assassination is what was proven in this case, unquote. Calling Flynt's conduct aberrational, Grutman tried to assure the Supreme Court that other responsible publishers need not worry about any precedent in this case. He empathetically stated that, quote, this is the wanton, reckless, deliberately malicious publisher who sets out for the sheer perverse joy of simply causing injury to abuse the power that he has as a publisher, unquote. But Justice O'Connor was clearly not convinced that a victory for Falwell could be contained, asking, quote, do you think a vicious cartoon should subject a drawer of that cartoon to potential liability, unquote? Grutman refused to put any limits on emotional distress claims, other than saying a jury would determine if a cartoon, quote, would be regarded by the average member of the community as so intolerable that no civilized person should have to bear it, unquote. It was a definite tactical error, with Justice White commented on with some dismay. Quote, well, Mr. Grutman, you're certainly posing a much broader proposition than is necessary for you to win this case, unquote. Justice White also said, quote, there is a long tradition of this, not just in this country, but back into English history. I mean, politicians depicted as horrible-looking beasts, and you talk about portraying someone as committing some immoral act. I would be very surprised if there were not a number of cartoons depicting one or another political figure as at least the piano player in a bordello, unquote. Almost 3 months later, on February 24th, 1988, Larry Flynt answered a phone call at his office. He found out he won the case with a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court. The unlikely victory also has an unlikely author. Chief Justice William Requisite, who at the time was viewed as anti-press, wrote the decision for the court. Seeking to frame the opinion in expansive terms, the Chief Justice began by citing past precedent. He said, quote, one of the prerogatives of American citizenship is the right to criticize public men and measures. Such criticism inevitably will not always be reasoned or moderate. Public figures will be subject to vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks, unquote. The First Amendment question before the court, he succinctly set forth, was, quote, whether a public figure may recover damages for emotional harm caused by the publication of an ad parody offensive to him, and that is intended to inflict emotional injury, even when that speech could not reasonably have been interpreted as stating actual facts about the public figure involved, unquote. The answer must be no, Requisite wrote, unless a jury finds that, quote, the publication contains a false statement of act which was made with actual malice, such as with knowledge that the statement was false or with reckless disregard as to whether or not it was true, unquote. Applying the Supreme Court case in New York Times versus Sullivan, actual malice safeguards were necessary, he added, quote, to give adequate breathing space to the freedoms protected by the First Amendment, unquote. Requisite explained that protecting such parody was absolutely necessary because, quote, were we to hold otherwise, there can be little doubt that political cartoonists and satirists would be subjected to damages awards without any showing that their work falsely defamed its subjects, unquote. Looking back on Thomas Nast's cartoons attacking the corruption of New York City's boss, Tweed, He quoted experts who pointed out such art succeeded in its day through, quote, the continuously goes beyond the bounds of good taste and conventional manners, unquote. Requisite declared, quote, from the viewpoint of history, it is clear that our political discourse would have been considerably poorer without them, unquote. He said, quote, there is no doubt that the caricature of Falwell and his mother published in Hustler is at best a distant cousin of the political cartoons described above, and a rather poor relation at that. If it were possible to separate the one from the other, public discourse would probably suffer little to no harm. But we doubt that there is any standard, and the pejorative description outrageous does not supply one. Outrageousness in the area of political and social discourse has an inherent subjectiveness, which would allow a jury to impose liability on the basis of the jurors' tastes or views, or perhaps their dislike of a particular expression, unquote. The decision was as impactful as it was surprising. Public figures simply cannot recover from even the most outrageous, unbelievable satiric attacks, despite the fact that there may be an intent to cause emotional harm. It also reaffirmed the Sullivan decision and its free speech protections of the press from lawsuits brought by public figures as a bedrock principle of the First Amendment. As Chief Justice Requisite said in his decision, quote, at the heart of the First Amendment is the recognition of the fundamental importance of the free flow of ideas and opinions on matters of public interest and concern. The freedom to speak one's mind is not only an aspect of individual liberty, and this a good unto itself, but also is essential to the common quest for truth and vitality of society as a whole, unquote. For Flynt and Falwell, the far-reaching decision would eventually lead to a strange new chapter in their continuous relationship. Immediately after the Supreme Court announced their ruling, the pair traded predictable insults. But almost 10 years later, with the opening of People vs. Larry Flynt and the release of Flynt's autobiography, both men appeared together on CNN's Larry King Live, and Falwell hugged Flynt. Afterward, Falwell came to Flynt's office to propose the two, quote, go around the country debating moral issues and First Amendment issues, unquote. Over the course of this tour and in the years that follow, the two visited each other and developed a relationship. A few days later, or a few days after Falwell's death in 2007, Flynt wrote in the Los Angeles Times that, quote, the ultimate result was one I never expected and was just as shocking a turn to me as was winning that famous Supreme Court case. We became friends, unquote. This is quite a happy ending. With the Supreme Court case as germane, let's go over a modern example by looking at Saturday Night Live. Donald Trump has been obsessed with Saturday Night Live for years. He is the only politician to have hosted the show twice, first as a reality television star in 2004, and then as a presidential candidate in 2015. He tweeted about the ratings for his second hosting gig given separate times and bragged that his appearance had garnered SNL its, quote, best ratings in 4 years, unquote. Yet Trump's appreciation with SNL was short-lived. Just a few weeks before the election, Trump tweeted, quote, watch Saturday Night Live, hit job on me. Time to retire the boring and unfunny show. Alec Baldwin's portrayal stinks. Media rigging election, unquote. A month later, despite his election victory, Trump was venting, quote, I watched parts of NBC's Saturday Night Live last night. It was a totally one-sided biased show. Nothing funny at all. Equal time for us? Totally biased, not funny, and Baldwin's impersonation just can't get any worse. NBC News is bad, but Saturday Night Live is the worst of NBC. Always a complete hit job. It's just a political ad for the Dems, unquote. President Trump's escalating fury towards SNL was evident in his increasingly explicit calls to bring federal power to bear on the television program. He wanted legal action taken. He then even went so far as to threaten a government investigation of the entertainment series. Although it's debatable whether SNL's mockery of President Trump is any harsher than their treatment of past presidents. For example, some have argued that Chevy Chase's portrayal of President Gerald Ford as a bumbling foot contributed to his losing election. His public attacks on the program are unprecedented for a president. Based on the Hustler versus Falwell case, there's nothing Trump can legally do to stop the satire. No matter how outrageous, no matter how filled with animus, no matter how hurt the feelings. Mockery, caricature, and ridicule are the price that all public figures pay to keep America's most outlandish ideas free-flowing. Essentially, this case allows the First Amendment to protect you when you do a parody of public figures. This is important for allowing you to criticize and provide commentary on public figures for their actions. Public figures cannot win a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress based on a parody or satire, even if it is highly offensive and meant to cause distress. This ruling limits the ability of public figures to use the courts to silence or punish satire and parody. Also, if a public figure wants to win any defamation-related claims, they need to prove that the statement was a false statement of fact made with actual malice, where the publisher knew it was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. So, if you want to go make fun of a political figure or any other public figure, you have the right to do so. Just keep in mind that anyone can also make fun of you, too. Still, we all can't control who makes fun of who, and we can't take legal action against someone because they hurt our feelings through parody or satire. In the next video, we will talk about the right to espouse thoughts people hate. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.